is Shirley Wilson. I am the treasurer for the Historical Society. I have known my buddy for a long, long time. So it's a privilege and an honor for me to present to y'all this afternoon Jasper Barber. A lot of cousins, I know them, know some of them, but anyway, welcome to you all. I have known Jasper for many, many years. I met Jasper when I worked for Martin County Tourism Authority in the Biggs house. Jasper came to the Biggs house and we talked for a period of time. He knew people that I knew, and I knew people that he knew. So our friendship started in that moment and has continued over the many, many years that we have known each other, along with his wife, Mary. Jasper attended school in Janesville from 1945 to 1956. At 1956, Jasper farmed 100 acres of land and tried to go to school too. He decided that he could not serve two masters. Jasper quit the 11th grade in November and on December the 28th enlisted in the United States Air Force. He remained in the Air Force and retired with 24 years of service as a senior master sergeant. During that time, he served in public relations, recruiting, and as a historian. He attended MC Martin Community College in Williamston from 81 to 82. He then went on to East Carolina University from 82 to 84. He graduated with magna cum laude in May 1984 with a BS degree in English. Jasper was the only child of Frank and Iseline, is that how you pronounce the name, Iseline Barber, to graduate from college. In 84, he accepted a job with the Public Affairs Office at Seymour Air Force Johnson, based in Goldsboro. He became the Deputy Chief of the 4th Fighter Wing Public Affairs Office and served in that position until retiring a second time on March the 1st, 2001. Jasper told me that he had published a book, Memories of the Islands, and wanted to know, would we sell the books? And he brought some to us, and I told him yes, that we would. Well, the books went fast, and we got some more, and those went too, right? Yeah. The book of his real life stories of Jasper and his family. Jasper's story is factual and honest about the times and events. Memories of the Islands will pull at your heartstrings and make you laugh and jog the memories of the older generation about a time that was what it was when he was growing up. And also will make you cry if you read it. Jasper left that world at the age of 18, seeking to find a better one. But the memories of his youth and that place stuck to him, like the waterline on the trees in the island swamps. Jasper is married to Mary Jane Rogers. They married on October 2nd, 1959 in Brewer, Maine. They have two sons, Dean and Larry, a granddaughter, Kelly, and a grandson, Chad. They reside all in Goldsboro. It is with great pleasure and honor that I present to you Jasper Barber.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I didn't think that I'd ever grow old enough that people would want to know what life was like when I was a kid. So thank you for inviting me here today. And I see in the audience some of my relatives and a friend of ours that I used to know. She's changed since she was a kid. But it is a pleasure to be here. And I can tell you that although I've been gone from Martin County since 1957, except for that 3-year period I came back and went to college, this is still my home. This is still where I want my ashes to be spread down in the islands when I die, if I don't move back here and have it done here. But my sons know this is where my heart is. The question I was asked to answer today is what was the difference about growing up in the island? What was different about growing up in that place? I was born in 1938, as she mentioned. One of the things I learned when I wrote the book is I was born the same day that the Germans began their attack on the Jewish people. They were called Kristall night. They began to burn their synagogues and homes. The persecution began that night. When I tell people who are not familiar with Martin County that I grew up in the island section of the county, the first thing they say is, I didn't know there were any islands in Martin County. They seem to think the islands are all out on the coast. But I promise you, when I was growing up, there were islands in Martin County because I lived on one island. The first thing you have to understand is where I grew up. On Highway 64 between Williamson and Janesville, there are two roads today that are called East Island Road towards Janesville and West Island Road towards Williamson. It's really a loop road, it just goes around. But they call it East Island Road and West Island Road for whatever reason. There are two levels of the island. If you go back there today, and if you can ever go back there when the river is flat, you can see it a lot better. You go down the first hill, and you hit a swamp. And you go across the swamp, and you find land, ridges. Those are islands. When you get down to the middle of where East and West Island roads meet, you come to Frank Barber Road. Frank was my dad. It goes down again. But they built the road at the same level as East and West Island Road across the swamps to our farm. And our farm was called the Moore Farm, and we had a home in the middle of that farm. That's the Moore Island that I grew up on. All of those roads when I was a kid were cart paths. And I might mention they were one way. There were places where if you happened to meet somebody coming in the opposite direction, you could pass. But basically they were cart paths, one-way streets. The only road that was built off of Highway 64 was East Island Road, and it was only built down across the first swamp to that curve you come around now that leads up to the river. Right there in the curve of that road, there was another cart path that led back up across another swamp where the Holiday family lived. That was where I went to school there. The one word that describes living in the islands in the 1940s was isolation. We were cut off from everything and everybody. And the cause of that isolation was the lack of roads and electricity. Let me tell you how I got to school. First of all, let me say there were no dams on the Roanoke River. There were no dams on the Roanoke River. The first dam that was built on the river was Carr Lake Dam, and it was built in '53, well before the time I'm speaking of here. If the water was in the swamps, we had to walk about a half a mile to get from our house down to the first swamp. My brother would put us in a boat, and he would paddle us across that swamp over to where East and West Island Road is now. And then we would walk from there to the bus. And the distance, if you measured with a vehicle from the middle of that farm to there now, 3 miles. And then we didn't take that road when I was a kid because the Frank Barber Road wasn't there. We had to go around fields and through the swamps. And sometimes when the water was high, we had to go in other directions. So what I'm trying to tell you is getting to school was difficult. We missed a lot of school because my mom did not send us out in the pouring rain or snow. If it was too cold to go or it was raining, we just didn't get to school that day. And of course, living on a farm, there were times when Dad needed workers. And the kids were the workers, so we worked a lot. Transportation back then was, there were 3 ways you could go. You could walk, you could ride a mule or a cart, or a boat. And I didn't think about this until I started preparing my remarks for today. But that's the same way that Jesus got around when he walked on the earth 2,000 years ago. You know, it's been that long from that part of the world where I grew up in. We could not participate in after-school activities because we didn't have a way to get them. Visits from family members was rare. I mean, you could get into the island of town, but it was very difficult. You could not drive a vehicle in there most of the time because it was wet. You get stuck. Visiting family members outside of the islands was difficult for us. I remember as a small boy going to my father's neighborhood in Jasper Barber neighborhood, they call it. We went there one time when I was a kid to attend a funeral for one of my father's brothers who had died. That's all the memory I have of ever visiting my dad's relatives, and they only live about 15 miles away from me. Going to town was a twice-a-year thing for the kids. We went to school to get some clothes and shoes, and we came back. That was it. I remember my mother, when the water was really high, and it was difficult to get out through the cart path road, going to the north end of the water farm, and one of her stepsons would put her in a boat. And we had a small Evinrude motor that went on it. He would drive her through the swamps, out to Devil's Gut, from Devil's Gut into Roanoke River, to the landing up there where 13 crosses the river. You got a beautiful boat ramp there now. But when my mother went there, it was just a muddy discount. She would get out of the boat, walk to Martin Supply, and get whatever she needed, and walk back, and that's the way they got back to the farm. Our only means of communicating was a battery-powered radio. And my parents used that primarily to get news and weather reports. You didn't sit around and listen to music during the day, you know, it ran the battery down. One of the advantages of living back there at that time was we didn't get bothered by any traveling salesmen. Our mailbox was located on Highway 64. You remember where Grady Goddard's number 90 station used to be? Well, the mailbox was on the other side of the road. So we didn't go check our mail every day either. And if there was somebody that lived back there with us, but they were coming that way, they'd get your mail and bring it in for you. Before those roads were built back there, we had 3 engines on the farm. We had the outboard motor. My mother had a Maytag washing machine that ran on gasoline, and our refrigerator operated off of kerosene. That was it. Those are the only 3 machines we had on the farm. Everything else was done on that farm was mule power or muscle power for the men. And trust me, there was a lot of muscle power that went into it. Take, for example, the wood that we needed to heat the house with, for my mother to cook the food with, and to cure the tobacco in the tobacco barn. You talk about a chore, and the way we did that was the old cross-cut saw. One guy on the other side, one on this side. It was a hard thing to do. The county roads, if I remember correctly, they began to build those in around 1949, 50, and 51, and 52 in that area. And they built them in sections. The road that came in from the East Island Road, where we met the school bus, was built along the same path as the cart path, all the way up to where Frank Barber Road is today. It stopped there. Then the next section of the road was built from there over to 64, the West Island part of it. The last road that was built in there was the Frank Barber Road. And my dad agreed to cut the right-of-way for him because the road that you see now was trees. swamps and trees, nothing but mountains and trees. He agreed to cut the right of way for them and give them the dirt that it took to fill that road up to the level it is now. And they did. That's how we got our road built in there. Roads that have been built off of that road was, of course, Fred Hardison Road, Wendell Griffin Road, and then the Frank Mark. Those are the three roads that were built off of it. After we got the roads, the electricity came in. And the school bus finally came to within a half a mile of our house. And we were able to get to school fairly easy for a change. Before they built the roads, my dad sold timber on the farm. And in order for the log trucks to get in and out, the logging company had to build a temporary road. And they did that with large oak planks that were put down across the swamp. So when the water was up, they couldn't get in, but when the water was down, they could get on those planks and go in and out. And that was the first thing that sort of opened up the islands for us, because you could drive a vehicle in there now if the water wasn't high. But that's how they got the logs out. But here's the other thing. At the north end of the Moore farm, they built a railroad track all the way across the farm, back into the swamps to the ridges towards Devil's Gut. And they would go in there with these boxcars they had for a locomotive to pull, load those logs out of the swamps and the ridges onto there, and bring them back out to the farm, transfer them to log trucks, and then they would take them out. I look back on that, my dad couldn't have got a whole lot of money out of that. I mean, the trouble they had to go to build the road and to go in there and get the timber and bring it out. But that's how we got the logging, logs out of the island. And that was before they built Frank Barber Road. You ask yourself, how did people survive in those days? That's a good question. We lived off the land. My mom had a huge garden. I call it my mom's garden because my mom spent more time in the garden than anybody else did. But it was a huge garden. And we ate out of that garden during the summer. And what we couldn't eat, she canned. And we ate it during the winter. But she raised just about everything that you could raise. We had several pecan trees. I love pecans. Today still I love pecans. Black walnuts. We had black walnut trees. I love those. And then in the fall of the year, when we could hunt, we ate just about every animal that you could shoot legally. And we ate coon, possum, rabbit, deer, squirrels, birds. And my dad even a few times got a turtle, cleaned it up, and he had turtle soup. I don't remember what it tastes like,
Chicken.
but I can tell you that I wouldn't put all that effort into killing a turtle today to do it. As a matter of fact, when I was a kid, I loved to hunt. But I wouldn't kill an animal today unless my stomach told me that you're going to starve to death if you don't. I've just changed. It's not that I can't eat it. It's just that I'd rather see it alive than shoot it. We have deer and gopher that come into my backyard. And every time they come in, we just stop what we're doing and admire God's creation. They're beautiful animals. I couldn't shoot one now unless my stomach told me, you've got to do that, Jasper. Looking back on all my experiences in the islands, I realized that I grew up during a time of transition. When we got the roads in there, World War II had ended and things economically had picked up. And that was true for my dad on the farm. So we were able to buy tractors and we could tend the land with machines now. So I transferred from the mule and the horse doing all the work to a tractor. And with that coming in, we also saw the number of people that we had on the farm as tenants go down. We didn't need them anymore. The tractors could do it. I didn't realize I had lived during that period of time until after I left home. On the farm, work was the order of the day, and it didn't matter whether you were driving a mule or tractor. The first thing I discovered when I drove that tractor the first time, my dad had a co-op tractor, and we had a plow behind it that you would break the land with. And I remember the first day I drove that thing, when I got off of it, I was just as tired as if I had walked behind that wheel all day long. I mean, it was still work. I love farming. I didn't leave because I hated it. I loved it. But I left because I believed there was an easier way to make a living. A few memories of growing up back there. As I said, I loved to hunt and fish when I was a kid. I would walk from the middle of that farm 2 miles back through the other end of the farm in the swamp to get the Devil's Gut to fish. I mean, you know, like kids today that live 2 blocks from the park, they run down there and play. Well, to me, that was 2 blocks. I loved to do it, and I went and did it. Whenever I got some free time, you'd find me either hunting in the wintertime or fishing in the summer. I remember the smell of honeysuckle. I'm thinking that some places now you can't find honeysuckle. But I remember walking to school, and you'd walk past this bunch of honeysuckle along the road, and it smelled so good you didn't want to go any further. It just had a wonderful smell to it. I remember climbing a tree and eating fox grapes. You probably have no idea what a fox grape is, but it was a grape that grew on a vine, and it did not grow on the ground. It knew that there were hungry kids out there like me. So they grew up into the tree. But they didn't get away from me. I climbed up there where they were. And I can just picture myself sitting on a limb today, getting me a bunch of those grapes and eating them with my belly full and come back down. Those were good grapes, and I don't think you could even find them anymore. I remember picking briarberries. If you go along the hedgerows of those farms back then, there were these briars that produced the blackberry. And I would pick those things and bring them home to Mom, and she would turn those things into something delicious to eat. I remember picking the plums. We had a plum orchard with a whole bunch of plum trees. And I loved plums. Picking them for her to cook, and there were peaches that she would cook also for us. I remember the smells that came from my mom's kitchen. I could be outside working down at the barn feeding the hogs, and in the summertime especially, the windows were always open. No air conditioning. And a breeze blowing the smell of her cooking down to that barn. I mean, it was just a wonderful smell. A smell you don't forget. I remember the revivals that we had at Reddit's Grove Baptist Church. We were not regular goers, I'll admit that. But we did go occasionally, and I remember the revival they had every year. 7 days of revival, and the church was filled every night. And the dinner on the ground after that. I mean, those are memories that I just cannot forget. I remember seeing people being baptized in the creek, not too far from where the church was. They went to the creek being baptized, and they didn't have this fancy place in the church. And I vividly remember the night that I got out of my seat and walked down the aisle of that church and gave my life to Christ. It was the best decision I ever made in my life. And I have tried to live up to that commitment. I remember riding in a wagon filled with watermelons and listening to my dad hollering, "Watermelon, watermelon," and seeing people come out of the houses to get a watermelon. And my dad's watermelons were huge and they were good. The smell of the bakery next to Mark Supply in Winston. I remember just one time I went up to town with Mom, and we walked by that bakery, and you could smell the sweet stuff coming out of there. And I begged my mother for a dime. And I went back into that place and bought me 3 glazed donuts. And I ate every one. I didn't even give my mother one. But glazed donuts to this day are my favorite donut. It wasn't until I left that I began to realize that I was one of the luckiest kids in the world. That I was not poor and had been raised in a very, but I had been raised in a very rich family. I thought I was poor when I was a kid. And let me tell you, when I left home, I changed worlds. I discovered that my mom was the best cook in the world. Absolutely. I discovered the food that she cooked was better for me than anything that I have eaten since. If you've never eaten a chicken that was fresh, all you've ever had is a frozen chicken, you haven't eaten a chicken. It's something else. Freezing the chicken just takes a lot out of it. I realized I have never been hungry in my life, and I have never lacked something that I really needed. I may have not gotten all the things I wanted when I was a kid, but if I needed it, I got it. And when I left home, you know, there are people right here in this county today, especially kids, that are hungry. All over the country, as much as we have. But I've never been hungry a day in my life. I can honestly say that. My mother put 3 meals on the table every day. And it was good food. When I see how kids are raised today, I tell myself that if I were to come back into this life, would I want to be raised in an environment that is out there today? I would rather go back to living in the island. Yes, it was isolated. But brother, I'm telling you, we learned a lot of things back there. We learned how to survive. There were no welfare programs. My father was completely wiped out in August 1940 when a flood came in and covered everything on every island in the island. Every island was covered with water. I got a picture in that book of my dad standing on the highest place on the whole farm. That was the only building that the water did not come into the floor. It came close. We survived. We did not expect the government to give us any handouts. We made it. And we made it and helped other people along the way. There were some black people that lived across the swamp from us. And I can remember many times somebody coming to my house and asking my mother for a piece of pork to season a pot of collard together. And my mother would always go out there and get it for me. And I can remember the men who would come to my dad and borrow money. He would always pull it out and loan it to him, knowing that he would never see it again. But I tell you, I have a lot of fond memories in that island. But I can tell you that not everybody feels the way I do. I feel like I was blessed to be raised back there. And there are people who feel like they're cursed to be raised back there. Because the lesson of it, we've got the right attitude, things will turn out right. Thank you all for inviting me here today. I hope I've enlightened you. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
How many islands were there? How many islands were there back there?
There were many islands back there. Every ridge that was covered with water most of the year around it was an island. The Moore Farm was an island, the Griffin lived on an island, the Hollidays lived on an island. If you lived on East and West Island Road, there's a swamp in front of you and there's a swamp behind you. When the water is in there, you're covered. Everything back there was an island when the water was there. And the dams that they built did not stop the flooding in the islands. I have been back here a number of times, and I've gone back when the water was high. If the water is running across the field, running across the middle of the farm there where David lives, in the middle of the Moore Farm, all up into the fields and everywhere. The dams help to some extent, but the problem is the dams can only hold so much water. When they can't hold it, they turn it loose, and it comes down on us like it used to. It's just not as prevalent as it used to be, but it still happens. Right now it's a dry spell. We've been going through a dry spell, so the swamps are dry. back in my day, that was unusual. It seemed like when I was a kid, I loved to go down by where the swamps were, and I'd take a stick and stick it into the edge of where the water was, and I'd come back a couple of hours later to see if it was in the same place. And if the water was going away, it was going down. If it was coming up, it was still coming.
Did it go up to your house when it
It
flooded?
came within 50 yards of our house.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it covered the field sometimes?
Yeah, and that was our house, and to the barns that would come up behind the barns that we had down there. There were places where the swamps would come up into the field, and we had one called the ramp. And in that particular place, it would come almost up to the barn, but it didn't come into the barn.
Why was the house called Glover House, or that section called the Glover House
The
Hill?
Glover house, I don't know. You know, that was a house that was on a high spot on the farm. And somebody lived there at one time. When I was a kid, I remember putting hay in it and corn, tobacco, you know, for a storage facility. My brother, who owned that piece of land when my dad died, burned that house down. That was the worst thing he should have ever done. He could have torn the house down and sold the wood, because there are a lot of people who love old timber. And that house was put together with wooden pegs. A lot of people didn't know that, but if you went into the barn, the wooden pegs held that house together. And we threw it away. It was a part of history. I don't know why they called it that, but everything back on the farm had a name. The Glover house, you know. The largest island back there was the Moore farm. And I'd say, well, a couple of 100 acres, 150, 200 acres of land. And even that had a certain section called the 18-acre cut. Don't ask me why they called it that. They did. But there were places that had names. The Swain Field is a place that my father willed to me when he died. And there was a place beyond that called the Bob Green Ridge. There's another place up there called the Isaac Field. There was a ridge close to Devil's Gut called the Swain Landing Ridge. There were other islands close to Devil's Gut that were called the Little Beaver Place and the Big Beaver Place. And I remember going in there with my dad to get some of his hogs out of it. They would have the pigs over there. And when they come back to feed them at night, we knew they had their pigs, but the pigs wasn't with them. So we'd go back in there, and my father would put those pigs on a fertilizer site and wade through the swamp, and the sound would follow back to where we wanted it. But every place had a name.
When you were there, the stories that Mom and Dad used to tell me was that it was self-sufficient because there was a lumber mill,
My
and there was
dad,
a fishery, and Mom said at one time there was actually a store back where, right beside where Uncle Ben's house was, you know. Do you remember any of that?
no, I don't remember the story of that. What happened after the tractors came in, the roads opened up, my brothers who had been farming with my dad bought their own farms. My brother Major bought one on 64, Harry bought one on 64, and Clyde bought one down on Fred Harrison Road. They moved pretty much out of the island. And Harry had a store out there by his place. I don't remember those stores back there. I remember Herbert, remember
Did
Little
it have the
Herbert?
lumber mill and the fishery?
Little Herbert used to have an ice chest.
Yeah, I
up
remember
there.
that little house.
I had a nephew who was about that tall, and he was, we don't know how he came into the world, we don't know who his daddy was, but he was one of my sister's son, and my dad took care of him his whole life, and he was a character.
And he would.
In today's environment, they put him in an institution. Back then, we took care of our people. I remember a fellow in Janesville who had a big jaw, I can't remember his name.
Spit Martin,
Yeah,
Spit Martin,
that's right.
Yeah, you remember him?
I do.
He was one of the friendliest, nicest guys you'll ever meet. When I was a kid, when I went to Janesville and he was there, you could always joke and kid with him. He was just a nice guy. But he was born with defect, and he had no control over that, like her, no control. And there were people that we still took care of. We didn't put them in a place where somebody else did. And I admired that about my family and about the community we grew up in. We took care of the kids that were born with defect. You know, I'm so glad. I'm 83 years old, and my sister-in-law asked me how I was doing this morning. I said, great. And I am. What have I got to complain about? My mother died when she was 60 years old. When I turned 60, I was worried. 64, I'm sorry. When I turned 64, I was wondering if I got my mother's gene. Now, I'm hoping that I got her gene so that when she died, she went to bed and went to sleep and didn't wake up. I hope I've got that gene. The worst thing about dying is the way you have to go. If you just go swiftly, you know, it's over with, it's wonderful. But if you have to struggle, like a lot of people do, death is not an easy thing. If you're a Christian, you ain't got nothing in this world to hold on to. Everything you're reaching out for, something better.
I was just curious, is the railroad that you talked about with the logging company, is that still back there? Or
No.
did
When
they
they-
take it all up?
After they got through taking care of the timber, they took down the railroad. I wished many a time, but back then I had a camera that I could have documented all of the things that I saw. That's one of the things I wish I had. But they took the track down. And here again, you know, that was an enormous task, building that
Yeah.
railroad across the farm, back into those swamps. And I remember they had this little car that you could crank. My brother had some hogs on one of the ridges next to Devil's Gap. And I remember getting on that little car with my brother. And we put food on it for the hogs. And we cranked that thing on the weekends when they weren't using it. Back in there, feed his hogs and crank it back out. That was, I mean, you know, that was an experience. That was my first experience on a railroad. I did not ride a railroad until I joined the Air Force in '57, and they sent me down to Texas by train. That was my first ride on a railroad. And when I left Texas, my first ride in an airplane was getting back to North Carolina. I mean, the world totally changed when I left. And I found out that the world I was from was a pretty good world.
I'd like to ask also, is because it's so low in there, whatever, were there many cemeteries in there, or was it that people did not bury their people in that area? I just wondered.
A lot of people? Okay. When you come in on East Island Road, there used to be somebody that lived in a house on the right there. And then you come on down and come across the first swamp, there used to be somebody that lived in a house on the right. And then in the curve of the road, if you went up in the across the other swamp, the Holidays lived up there. And then around the curve and to your right, the Griffins lived. Mr. Will Griffin and his family, and I think Fred Griffin's family lived up in there. Wendell Griffin. And then my sister lived back up in that part of the island too. And then you come on down, and Mr. Charlie Williams lived on the left. He had a gang of beautiful girls, I might add that. He was a black guy, but he had some beautiful daughters. I mean, when you walk by there, you couldn't miss it if you were a boy. And on further down, my dad owned a farm called the Smith Place. So there was someone living there. A little further down was Anthony Perry, was a black family that lived there. And on down there was the Nichols family that lived there. And then there was I think it was one or two other families, I don't know who they were that lived in there. But that was pretty much it. There wasn't a lot of people living in there.
I think he asked you about cemeteries back there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I thought you meant people living back there. There were no cemeteries back there.
That was good to hear too.
We didn't kill anybody.
But where were your family's members that passed, Jasper? Where were they buried?
Martin Memorial, most of
Okay.
them, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a, I have two of my brothers decided they want to bury out on 64. My personal opinion is that one day there are going to be so many people, we're going to need to plant corn on that spot. And that's totally what they're going to do. If I put my ashes back into the soil, it'll help the soil, right? I mean, the body is going to rot. One day, it's not going to be there. It's going to go.
Were there Indians back there, living back there?
The Indians did live back there, absolutely. On the farms, I've got some arrowheads that I picked up, and I've got some pottery that I picked up. And there were, at one time, people living even farther back in the islands than where we live. There was a ridge back there on the Isaac field, and they had a road that went up the ridge and then across over the Devil's Gut. I remember the house that they lived in, all was left was the frame, the wood frame. And it eventually rotted away, but it was still there when I was a kid in the 40s and 50s.
Were they bad Indians? Because I heard during my childhood that you don't want to go back there because there were bad people back there.
Well,
That's
you
true
know,
everywhere.
I have heard things like that about those people who lived in the islands
Okay.
were different. But we were the same as the other people, we were just cut off. But we committed our share of the sin, and we did our things a little differently. But we were the same as everybody else, really. I mean, everywhere I've been, I found that people are basically the same. You find some good ones, and you find some bad ones. You hang around with the good ones.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious. You've lived a long time and you've seen a lot of things. I'm curious as to what you think are good changes that you have seen in your life, and what do you think may be a negative invention or change in the way of life. And then I wonder if you would be willing to just kind of just give a solitary piece of advice that you kind of have learned in your life.
Well, that's a big question. There are lots of things that have changed for the better. You know, the fact that we can get in an automobile and go anywhere we want in America. And most of us can do that. I mean, even if you're poor, you can find somebody who'll take you if you just ask them. I love that. I love the fact that we can get in an airplane and go places. When I was a kid, you could do that, but you had to have a lot of money. It was never occurred to me that I could get into an airplane and go anywhere when I lived in the island. It was, when I left Texas, the Air Force paid my ticket to get to my next base. If I had to get it out of my paycheck, I would have had to thumb a ride. So that's good. I think mass communications is both good and bad. We have kids today that can get on their phone and get in all kinds of trouble. And you hear talk of them all the time. Some of them dying because they got in touch with the wrong person and talked into something they shouldn't have been talked into. It's good and it's bad. The roads that we have today, compared to the cart paths, are wonderful. I have not been anywhere in this country where I complained about the roads. The roads I grew up on were terrible, but anything other than that has been good. Modern medicine is wonderful. I had hernia surgery on the 15th of last month. I had to have 2 holes patched in my stomach. I pumped one here, one here, one here, and one here. They patched a hole down here and one up in the middle of my stomach. They glued me back together. I went in the hospital at 9 o'clock and I was back on at 2. I slept most of the rest of the day, got up the next day, and pretty much started doing routine stuff. I'm completely healed. I can do anything I want to do. That would never have happened when I was a kid. Never. I mean, so, you know, I look at that, and I can tell you that my wife is still alive because of modern medicine. Now, let me say this. I think sometimes modern medicine goes too far. Keeping somebody alive just to keep them alive is not good. They would have died if he hadn't had it. So my wife and I both have living will. We tell them when it comes time, let's go. Don't spend no more money on it. Those are some of the really good things that I see. And globalization has made things a lot better for us. What I mean by that is that things that I ate when I was a kid came from the farm. You can go to the stores now and buy foods from all over the world. And globalization has made that possible. There are a lot of good things that you can buy from other countries to eat. So, you know, that's good too, a choice of foods. And I think really food is still the cheapest thing that we have. It's expensive, more expensive now than it was. But let me tell you, I still have a garden. I love my garden. And as long as I'm able, I'm going to eat vegetables out of my garden. And you can't beat that. But our food is still relatively cheap. Thank God for farmers. Thank God for the Latinos that come up and do the dirty work for us. I know a lot of people that criticize those people from coming up. But if I lived in a South American country and the president opened the door, I would walk up just like the rest of them are doing. I don't blame them for coming. I blame our president for letting so many come in that we can't handle.
Amen.
We cannot handle 2 million people. We've got people sleeping on the streets. Veterans who are going without. We don't have enough housing for the people we have, and we're bringing 2 million more people in. And taxpayers are having to pay for it. That is not good. I see our country going in the wrong direction. We are living in the post-Christian era. Fewer and fewer people are living by faith. And we're living based on what the culture wants. If our culture says it's okay to do this, it's okay to do this. And something that's wrong is wrong, and you can't say it's right and make it right.
Mr. Barber, back in the early 50s, I went to a church that had just been built in the islands, and I remember what the road was like trying to get there, and there was just trees. There was a spot big enough for that church. Do you remember that church?
No.
I think it was the Holiness Church, and I don't know exactly where it was at, but I know what you're talking about, the roads. I was probably 12 years old then.
Everybody that I have talked to that has ever been into the island before the roads were built did not forget that experience.
That was an experience. And the church had very little parking around it there. It was like it hadn't been cleared up yet. It was like a new church. And another question is, where's Devil's Gut? I think I've heard my son fishing.
I'm wondering
talk
if
about
people
that.
understood that
Where
phrase.
is-
She doesn't understand what devil's
Devil's
gut
gut.
is.
Devil's
Explain
Gut,
that.
okay. Here again, that's another island. Roanoke River runs from Williamston to Jamestown. Just below Williamson is Highway 13, just below that. The Devil's Gut breaks off from Roanoke River. And it runs behind my daddy's land and other people's land along the river and comes out in Janesville.
Okay.
So that whole section between Devil's Gut and the river is really an island. And then within Devil's Gut, where I used to go fishing, there was another island just across Devil's Gut. Where again, there was another one of those breakoffs. Devil's Gut, and I don't know why I call it Devil's Gut, but it's still the best place in the fish. My son and I still come
My
down there.
son has talked about fishing there on the Roanoke, so I was wondering where it was.
There's some fishing holes in there that have maintained some trophy fish, but access to it. A lot of people don't know how to get to it or don't know where to go in there. But there's also some of the biggest cypress trees in the area back in the
Yeah.
Some of these where people would put their hands around. Some huge trees came out of there. That's why Mr. Frank was able to make money, because of the growth of trees and standing timber back in there.
They've been there for many years.
That's right.
They were beautiful, beautiful timber. I remember the timber that we got. It was beautiful.
Because my granddaddy was off the Griffin side that he keeps referring to.
Yeah.
That's the branch of the island that my folks came off. And when I was a kid,
The Griffin land and the Barber land joined and ran all the way back to Douglas County.
and when I was a kid growing up, the islands is the correct way to pronounce that word. But as a child, I grew up running it together, and we called it islands. Islands, that's the way it was said. And I got in trouble in school, was a school teacher who wanted, I'm taking away, but excuse me, but the school teacher wanted to write a little synopsis for Father's Day card for all the kids. And I had to stand in the corner because I would not let her put islands on my card. My daddy did not go to the islands. He went to the islands. And she made me stand in the corner for that. She wouldn't accept my correction.
You're correct.
Yeah.
And
It
you
wasn't
haven't
until later
been,
on we,
go. You can go in by the asphalt plant, that's the west side. You go on down, they call it Barber Road, which Jasper was talking about, and then come back out on this side, east side.
That's
But
right.
you can go down Barber Road and go way back in there. It's well worth your time.
yeah,
to
you
go
can,
visit.
you know, if the river floods, I'd like for you to wait until the river floods. And then get on Frank Barber Road and just go all, you can drive all the way through the farm, there's nobody gonna shoot you. Just drive through the farm and you can see everything.
Just stay out in the fields.
And if the water is too high, there's one place where you won't be able to go. Her brother David lived down there. The water at times, I remember having to get in a mule and cart to get across the water to come across the farm too. It was so high. We didn't run out of water in the islands, I promise you. And one of the good things about living back there is you could drive a pump into the ground anywhere. You pump water out of the ground. Whenever I buried hogs, and whenever a hog died, we always buried them. I would have to get up on the hill. If you went down the low side of the hill, you strike the water.
Well, on the Griffin side, talking about the water being so prevalent, on the Griffin side, it wasn't uncommon for us to have overflows in different areas, so you didn't have to go get water at the home places.
Yeah.
Did y'all have a lot of overflows
We
that you
had-
had at different places on the
There
farm?
was a couple I know. One I specifically remember. It came out of this little hill, and it was cool all the time.
I remember one on Granddaddy's side, he had a great big, huge granite slab, and that overflow splashed on that. And I can remember as a little girl standing there barefoot on that cold stone, bending over, drinking that water. As good as you'd ever taste. But that was a long time ago.
Some of the things, I want to finish answering your question, some of the things that have been bad about modern civilization is that we have lost the work ethic. Everywhere I go today, there's a sign that says, help wanted. And nobody wants to work. And kids that grow up today, I feel sorry for them. They have nothing to do in the communities they grow up in to get in trouble. I learned that work is good for you. I really believe that the reason I live this long is because I have kept my body in shape. I've been retired, but I told my wife, I said, if I'd known it was going to be this much work, I'd kept on working. But I stay busy. Every day I walk, if the weather's decent. And if I don't walk, that means I do a day's work in the yard. But what I'm trying to tell you is that kids today will sit on the couch and play with these machines. They have nothing to do. Nothing. Unless they live on a farm. And then the government is real cautious about how much you work the kids. I mean, when I grew up, there was nobody looking out for me. Dan had something to do, we did it. Any other questions?
I have just one, and I will keep you. On the farm, did you ever have any persimmons trees? This is something that we don't see anywhere anymore.
That's where we got the coons.
That's right.
What?
We got the coons out of those too.
Oh, okay.
But they love
They
it.
love those persimmons, yeah. We never ate those persimmons.
Okay.
They were just bitter. If you did try to eat one, you wanted to make sure the frost had gotten it first.
All right.
I found out in Goldsboro, where you know this Korean girl that works out at the base. And she has persimmon trees. But these are oriental persimmon trees. And they grow about this tall, they're about this big around, and they have persimmons this large. And they are delicious. But the ones we have on the farm were not. Another thing we had was crab apples. Wild crab apples. Now, they were not good to eat. But my mother would take them and turn them into jam. And they were good that way.
A lot of sugar. A lot of
Yeah.
sugar.
Yeah. Another thing about growing up on the farm. I go to the recycling center with my week's garbage once a week. I carry more garbage to that place once a week than we carry to the garbage dump once a year. We did not throw anything away. What we couldn't eat, the dogs ate, the hogs ate, or the chickens ate. And the few things that we bought, if it was a can, like we had Louisiana coffee back then, chicken, they call it. Got that big. My mother would take those cans and we would put sausage on it after we killed hog. She would cook the sausage, put it in the can,
Good Lord.
and put lard on it,
That's right.
and it would keep forever. When you wanted some sausage, all you had to do was pull it out, throw it in the frying pan, and heat it up. Oh, it was good.
Farm life was the same as you was, except we didn't have the water. In Berkeley County. Won't it? Farming was the same, everything you talked about.
Yeah, but I know what you
We
mean.
we didn't have to wade in the water to get to the.
And we didn't have wells. Dad would drive the pump pipe down.
Yeah,
We had a well.
He'd have a thing down there, when it would stop up, he'd shoot down there to open it back up.
Yeah, we had the pumps.
I had a well.
Once we had a well too for the meal and the hog. But the pumps, we had those at different places on the farm. And you could drink the water right out of it. There was no worry about you dying from the water. Another thing that is missing today are the herons in the river.
That's the way.
Right.
When we were kids,
It was swamp.
in the springtime, we would catch herons and salt them down in a barrel, and then we would eat those the rest of the year too. And I can remember going to Devil's Cup with my dad. We had gill nets set along the banks, catching fish. We ate a lot of fresh fish when I was a kid. Fish is one of the best things you can eat, especially if they're fresh.